The Ancient City, Book 4, Chapter 4. The Aristocracy Governs the Cities. The same revolution, under forms slightly varied, took place at Athens, at Sparta, at Rome, in all the cities, in fine, whose history is known to us. Everywhere it was the work of the aristocracy. Everywhere it resulted in suppressing political royalty and continuing religious royalty. From this epoch, during a period whose duration was very unequal in different cities, the government of the city was in the hands of the aristocracy. This aristocracy rested at the same time on birth and religion. It had its foundation in the religious constitution of the family. It originated in the same rules that we have noticed above, in the domestic worship and in private law, that is to say, the law of the hereditary descent of the sacred fire, the right of primogeniture, and the right of pronouncing the prayers, which was the prerogative of birth. An hereditary religion was the title of this aristocracy to absolute dominion, and gave it rights that appeared sacred. According to ancient ideas, he alone could be an owner of land who had a domestic worship. He alone was a member of the city who embodied the religious character which constituted the citizen. He alone could be a priest who was a descendant of a family having a worship. He alone could be a magistrate who had the right to offer the sacrifices. A man who had no hereditary worship might be the client of another man, or, if he preferred it, he could remain without the pale of all society. For many generations, it did not enter the minds of men that this inequality was unjust. No one had thought of establishing human society upon any other principles. At Athens, from the death of Codrus to the time of Solon, all authority was in the hands of the Eupatrids. They alone were priests and archons. They alone acted as judges and knew the laws, which were not written, and whose sacred formulas were transmitted from father to son. These families preserved as much as possible the ancient forms of the patriarchal regime. They did not live united in the city, but continued to live in the various cantons of Attica, each on its vast domain, surrounded by its numerous servants, governed by its Eupatrid chief, and practicing its hereditary worship in absolute independence. During 4 centuries, the Athenian city was merely a confederation of these powerful heads of families, who assembled on certain days for the celebration of the central worship or for the pursuit of common interests. Men have often remarked how mute history is regarding this long period in the life of Athens, and in general in the life of Greek cities. They are surprised that, when it has preserved the memory of so many events from the times of the ancient kings, it has recorded so few of the time of the aristocratic governments. The reason is doubtless because at that time very few acts of general interest took place. The return of the patriarchal regime had almost suspended the national life. Men lived apart and had few common interests. The horizon of each one was the small group and the small hamlet where he lived, as Eupatrid or as servant. At Rome, too, each patrician family lived upon its estate, surrounded by its clients. Men came to the city to celebrate the festivals of the public worship and for the public assemblies. During the years that followed the expulsion of the kings, the power of the aristocracy was absolute. None but a patrician could fill the priestly office in the city. The vestals, the pontiffs, the salii, the flamens, and the augurs were chosen exclusively from the sacred caste. Patricians alone could be consuls. They alone composed the Senate. Though they did not suppress the assembly by centuries, to which the plebeians had access, they at any rate regarded the assembly by curies as the only one that was legitimate and sacred. The centuries had, in appearance, the election of the consuls, but we have seen that they could vote only on the names that the patricians presented. And besides, their decisions were submitted to the triple ratification of the Senate, the Curies, and the augurs. Patricians alone administered justice and knew the forms of the law. This political system lasted at Rome only a few years. In Greece, on the contrary, there was a long period during which the aristocracy was master. The Odyssey presents us with a faithful picture of this social state in the western portion of Greece. We see there a patriarchal regime strongly resembling what we have remarked in Attica. A few great and rich families own the whole country. Numerous slaves cultivate the soil or tend the flocks. The manner of living is simple. A single table suffices for the chief and the servants. These chiefs are called by a name which becomes, under other circumstances, a pompous title: Anaktes, Basiles. Thus it happened that the Athenians of primitive times gave the chief of the Genos the title of Basilems, and that at Rome the clients preserved the custom of calling the chief of the gens Rex. These heads of families have a sacred character. The poet calls them divine kings. Ithaca is very small, yet it contains a great number of these kings. Among them there is indeed a supreme king, but he is of little importance and appears to have no other prerogative than that of presiding at the council of the chiefs. It appears even from certain indications that this office is elective, and it is clear that Telemachus will not be the supreme chief of the isle unless the other chiefs, his equals, wish to elect him. Ulysses, returning to his country, appears to have no other subjects than the servants who belong to him personally. When he has slain some of the chiefs, their servants take up arms and sustain a contest which the poet does not think blameworthy. Among the Phaeacians, Alcinous has supreme authority, but we see him repair to an assembly of the chiefs, and we may remark that he does not convoke the council, but that the council summons the king. The poet describes an assembly of the Phaeacian city. It is far from being an assembly of the multitude. The chiefs alone, individually convoked by a herald, as at Rome for the Comitia Calata, assemble. They occupy seats of stone. The king makes an address and calls his auditors scepter-bearing kings. In Hesiod's city, the rocky Askra, we find a class of men whom the poet calls the chiefs, or kings. They are those who administer justice to the people. Pindar also shows us a class of chiefs among the Cadmeans. At Thebes he extols the sacred race of the Spartai, from which, at a later date, Epaminondas derives his descent. We can hardly read Pindar without being struck with the aristocratic spirit which still reigned in Greek society in the time of the Persian Wars. From this we may imagine how powerful the aristocracy was a century or two earlier. For what the poet boasts of the most in his heroes is their family, and we must suppose that this sort of praise was at that time highly valued, and that birth still seemed the supreme good. Pindar shows us the great families which were then conspicuous in each city. In the single city of Aegina, he names the Medylidae, the Theandridae, the Euxenidae, the Blepsiadae, the Cariadae, the Balichidae. At Syracuse, he extols a priestly family of the Imadae. At Agrigentum, that of the Emenidae, and so on for all the cities of which he has occasion to speak. At Epidaurus, the entire body of the citizens, that is to say, of those who had political rights, was for a long time composed of no more than 180 members. All the rest were outside the city. The real citizens were still fewer at Heraclea, where the younger members of the great families had no political rights. The case was a long time the same at Cnidus, at Istros, and at Marseilles. At Thera, all the power was in the hands of a few families which were reputed sacred. It was the same at Apollonia. At Erythrae, there was an aristocratic class called the Basilidae. In the cities of Euboea, the ruling class were called the Knights. We may remark here that among the ancients, as in the Middle Ages, it was a privilege to fight on horseback. The monarchy had already ceased to exist at Corinth when a colony set out from there to found Syracuse. The new city, therefore, knew nothing of royalty and was ruled from the first by an aristocracy. This class was called geomori, that is to say, proprietors. It was composed of families which, on the day of the foundation, had distributed among themselves, with all the ordinary rights, the sacred parts of the territory. This aristocracy remained for several generations absolute master of the government, and it preserved its title of proprietors, which seems to indicate that the lower classes had not the right of property in the soil. An aristocracy of the same kind ruled for a long time at Miletus and at Samos.